So there's this German philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer. It's 1818, and he's about to publish a book that will shock all of Europe. Because Schopenhauer, this guy raised in a strict Christian society, just declared that Buddhism is the greatest religion humanity has ever produced. And he's not alone. Leo Tolstoy, one of Russia's greatest writers, keeps Buddhist texts on his nightstand. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, says Buddhism is the most scientific religion. Albert Einstein calls it the religion of the future. But here's what's crazy. Most of these men never set foot in Asia. They never met a Buddhist monk. They lived in Christian societies where even talking about other religions could destroy your career. So how did Buddhism capture the minds of the West's greatest thinkers? Philosophers who shaped modern thought, scientists who changed the world, writers who defined literature, because what they discovered wasn't religion. It was something else entirely. And it might change how you see everything. But before I tell you what they found, you need to understand something. Buddhism was completely unknown in the West until the 1800s. And when it finally arrived, it came through the most unexpected channel. I'll tell you that story in a second. But first, let me show you just how deep this goes. All right, so I started researching this, and I thought I'd find maybe 3 or 4 famous Western figures who were Buddhism. I found way more than that. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who influenced Nietzsche, Freud, and Einstein, becomes obsessed with Buddhism and calls it superior to Christianity. Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace, studies Buddhism for decades and says it's the highest form of religion. Henry David Thoreau, the guy who wrote Walden, Buddhist texts completely shape his philosophy. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the father of American philosophy, introduces Buddhist ideas to American intellectuals. Carl Jung, founder of analytical psychology, says Buddhism offers what Western psychology is missing. Albert Einstein, the guy who figured out relativity, says Buddhism is the only religion compatible with modern science. Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, becomes a Buddhist scholar. And then there's Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche criticized Buddhism, but he was so influenced by it that he spent years writing about it. You don't spend that much time on something unless it's fundamentally shaped your thinking. What? So I started asking, what is going on here? Why are the greatest minds in Western civilization, people raised in Christian Europe and America, abandoning everything they were taught to embrace this Eastern philosophy? And that's when I discovered something wild. Buddhism wasn't just a religion to these men. It was a revolution. A complete rejection of everything Western society told them to believe. But to understand how Buddhism conquered Western minds, we have to go back to 1844, to a dusty library in Paris, where one man is about to make a discovery that will change everything. So it's 1844. There's this French scholar named Eugene Burnouf, and he's just translated the first accurate Buddhist text into a European language. Before this, everything Europeans knew about Buddhism was basically rumors, travelers' tales, missionary reports that were completely wrong. But Burnouf gets his hands on actual Sanskrit texts, and when he translates them, he realizes something shocking. Buddhism isn't what anyone thought it was. It's not about worshiping idols, it's not about weird rituals, it's not even really about religion in the Western sense. Buddhism is a philosophy, a psychology, a method for understanding the human mind. And Burnouf publishes his translations. And suddenly, European intellectuals, people who've been suffocating under rigid Christian doctrine, they get their hands on these texts, and their minds are blown. Because Buddhism is saying things that no Christian theologian would dare say. It says there's no eternal soul, there's no creator God judging you, there's no heaven or hell in the Christian sense. Instead, Buddhism says something radical. You are responsible for your own suffering, and you have the power to end it. What? For intellectuals who've spent their whole lives being told, believe this or go to hell, this is liberating. And the first person to truly understand what this means, the first Western philosopher to fully embrace Buddhism, is a German genius who's about to reject everything his Christian society believes in. So Arthur Schopenhauer is born in 1788, wealthy family, good education, and he's absolutely miserable. because Schopenhauer looks at human life and all he sees is suffering. People constantly wanting things, getting those things, then wanting more things. It never ends. And Christianity isn't giving him answers. The church just says, have faith. God has a plan. But Schopenhauer doesn't want faith. He wants understanding. So in 1818, he publishes The World as Will and Representation. And his entire philosophy is based on one idea. Life is suffering because we're driven by irrational desires we can't control. Sound familiar? That's literally the second noble truth of Buddhism. But here's the thing. Schopenhauer hasn't fully read Buddhist texts yet. He's working from fragments, from second-hand accounts. Then, in the 1830s, he gets access to Bernouilli's translations. And Schopenhauer realizes, everything I've been trying to figure out, Buddhism solved this 2,000 years ago. He becomes obsessed. He keeps a statue of Buddha in his study. Next to it, a bust of Kant. That's how much Buddhism means to him. He's putting Buddha on the same level as the greatest Western philosopher. And Schopenhauer starts writing. He says Buddhism is the best of all possible religions. He says Christianity is primitive by comparison. He says the doctrine of reincarnation makes more sense than the Christian heaven and hell. Remember, this is the 1840s. In Germany, saying Buddhism is better than Christianity could get you socially destroyed, could end your career, could get you labeled a heretic. Schopenhauer doesn't care, because he's found something true. And here's what happens next. Schopenhauer's philosophy spreads, and it influences everyone who comes after him. Friedrich Nietzsche reads Schopenhauer and develops his ideas about the will to power and the death of God. Nietzsche is critical of Buddhism. He thinks it's too pessimistic. But his entire philosophy is shaped by Buddhist concepts he learned from Schopenhauer. Sigmund Freud reads Schopenhauer and creates psychoanalysis. The idea that we're driven by unconscious desires? That's Schopenhauer, which means it's Buddhism filtered through German philosophy. Carl Jung reads Schopenhauer and becomes fascinated with Eastern thought. Jung later writes extensively about Buddhism and even writes a psychological commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Albert Einstein reads Schopenhauer as a teenager, and it shapes how he thinks about reality. Einstein later says, the religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend a personal God and avoid dogmas and theology. Buddhism answers this description. So you have this chain: Buddha, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, Jung, Einstein, modern psychology, and physics. Buddhism, through Schopenhauer, becomes embedded in Western thought. But while this is happening in Germany and America, something even more radical is brewing. Because a group of American intellectuals, some of the most famous writers in American history, are about to discover Buddhist texts. And what they do with this knowledge will spark a revolution that's still going on today. So it's 1844. Same year Bernouilli publishes his translations. Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of America's most influential thinkers, is in Concord, Massachusetts, and he gets his hands on some of the first Buddhist texts available in English. And Emerson is shocked because these texts are saying things that no one in Christian America is discussing. Ideas like, the divine is within you, not in some distant heaven. You don't need a priest to connect with truth. All beings are interconnected. Nature itself is sacred. Emerson starts teaching these ideas, and his protege, a guy named Henry David Thoreau, runs with them. Thoreau is in his 20s. He's questioning everything. Why do people live the way they do? Why do they work jobs they hate? Why do they accumulate possessions they don't need? And then Thoreau reads Buddhist texts, and everything clicks. In 1845, Thoreau goes to Walden Pond. He builds a cabin. He lives alone for 2 years. And what's he doing out there? He's practicing Buddhism without even knowing that's what it is. Thoreau writes, the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. That's a Buddhist observation about suffering, about how people are trapped in cycles of craving and dissatisfaction. And Thoreau's solution? Simplify. Let go of possessions. Be present. Live deliberately. That's Buddhism. But here's what's crazy. Thoreau's essay Civil Disobedience, the one about nonviolent resistance, goes on to influence Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi uses it to liberate India. And Martin Luther King Jr. uses Gandhi's methods for the civil rights movement. So you have Buddha, Thoreau, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. Buddhist philosophy of nonviolence travels from Asia to America, back to Asia, then back to America, and changes history. Think about that. Now, while this is happening in America, in Russia, Leo Tolstoy is having a crisis. It's the 1870s. Tolstoy has just finished War and Peace and Anna Karenina. He's one of the most famous writers in the world. He has wealth, fame, a family, everything, and he wants to kill himself. Because Tolstoy can't figure out the point of life. If we're all going to die anyway, what does anything matter? And the Russian Orthodox Church isn't giving him answers. They just tell him to have faith and follow the rules. But Tolstoy doesn't want faith. He wants understanding. So he starts reading everything, philosophy, religion, science, and then he discovers Buddhism. And Buddhism tells him something different from Christianity. It says, yes, life involves suffering. Yes, everything is impermanent, but that's not a reason to despair. Buddhism says suffering exists because we crave permanence in an impermanent world. We want things to stay the same. We want to hold on to pleasure. We want to avoid pain. But everything changes. Everything ends. And fighting against that truth creates suffering. So the solution isn't to find eternal life in heaven. The solution is to accept impermanence, to let go, to be present with what is right now. Tolstoy is transformed. He becomes a pacifist. He gives away his wealth. He starts living a simple life. He writes essays about nonviolence that later influenced Gandhi. And in his private letters, Tolstoy writes, "I have been reading Buddhist literature, and I am astonished at the profundity and clarity of its teachings. Buddhism is the highest form of religion that humanity has achieved." But here's where it gets really interesting. Because while writers and philosophers are discovering Buddhism through texts, scientists are discovering it through their own research into consciousness. And what they find is going to shock them. So Carl Jung is one of the founders of modern psychology. He started out working with Freud, but they had a falling out because Jung thought Freud was too focused on sex and not enough on spirituality. And Jung starts studying religions from around the world. Christianity, Gnosticism, alchemy, mythology, he's trying to understand the human psyche. Then in the 1920s and 30s, Jung encounters Buddhism, and he's stunned. Because Buddhism is describing psychological states that Western psychology hasn't even begun to understand. Buddhism talks about the ego as an illusion, about how our sense of self is constructed, about how we can observe our own thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them. Western psychology in the 1920s is still arguing about whether consciousness even exists. But Buddhism has had a sophisticated psychology for 2,000 years. Jung writes a psychological commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. He calls it one of the most important psychological texts ever written. He says Buddhism understands something that Western psychology is missing. The human mind has depths that go far beyond the personal ego. There are universal patterns, archetypes, collective unconscious, and Buddhism has been exploring these depths for millennia through meditation. Jung starts recommending meditation to his patients. He integrates Buddhist concepts into his therapeutic practice. And modern psychology, mindfulness therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance, and commitment therapy, all of these are influenced by Buddhist psychology that Jung helped introduce to the West. Then there's Albert Einstein. Einstein isn't a practicing Buddhist, but he studies Buddhist philosophy extensively, and he makes a statement that shocks people. He says, "The religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend a personal God and avoid dogmas and theology. Buddhism answers this description." Why would Einstein say this? Because Buddhism operates like science. It says, here's a hypothesis about suffering. Here's a method to test it. Try it yourself and observe the results. No faith required, just investigation. And Buddhism's view of reality, everything is impermanent, everything is interconnected, there's no fixed unchanging self, aligns with modern physics. Einstein's theory of relativity shows that space and time aren't fixed. Quantum mechanics shows that particles are interconnected across vast distances. Everything is in flux. Everything is relationship. Buddhism has been saying this for 2,000 years. Einstein sees Buddhism as the only religion that's compatible with scientific thinking, because it doesn't ask you to believe impossible things. It asks you to observe reality directly. So here's what's happening. Across a century, across continents, the greatest minds in Western civilization, philosophers, writers, psychologists, scientists, are all discovering Buddhism independently, and they're all finding the same thing, not a religion with commandments and judgment, but a method, a practice, a way to understand your own mind and reduce suffering. Schopenhauer finds a philosophy that explains human suffering. Thoreau finds a way to live simply and deliberately. Tolstoy finds meaning in a world without God. Jung finds a psychology more sophisticated than anything in the West. Einstein finds a religion compatible with science. Buddhism wasn't asking them to believe anything on faith. It was asking them to investigate, to test, to observe. And for the greatest minds in Western history, people who questioned everything, this approach was irresistible. But here's where Buddhism does something that no other tradition dares to do. Buddhism tells you not to believe in Buddhism. The Buddha literally said, "Don't accept what I'm teaching just because I said it or because it's written in scriptures. Test it yourself. If it works, use it. If it doesn't, discard it." Can you imagine if Jesus said that? Or Moses? Or Muhammad? But the Buddha did. Because Buddhism isn't about faith. It's about investigation. And this is why it attracted the greatest minds in Western history. Because these were people who questioned everything. They didn't want to be told what to believe. They wanted to discover truth for themselves. And Buddhism gave them permission to do exactly that. So why did history's greatest Western minds choose Buddhism? Because Buddhism met them where they were. It didn't ask them to abandon reason. It didn't threaten them with hell or bribe them with heaven. Instead, it offered a simple proposition. Your mind creates your experience of reality, and if you want to change your experience, you have to change your mind. For philosophers, that meant understanding the nature of suffering. For writers, that meant finding meaning without God. For psychologists, that meant exploring consciousness directly. For scientists, that meant reconciling spirituality with reason. Buddhism didn't give them easy answers. It gave them a method, a practice, a path. And when they walked that path, they found something profound. Not enlightenment, not nirvana, not some mystical state, just clarity, understanding, peace. In a world full of suffering, that's everything. All right, look. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you're clearly fascinated by how history's greatest minds actually thought. And here's the thing. There are so many more stories like this buried in history that nobody talks about. So do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button, because next week, I'm breaking down the Stoics, how Marcus Aurelius's philosophy conquered Rome and influenced every American president from George Washington to Theodore Roosevelt. And here's what I really want to know. Drop a comment below and tell me, which of these figures surprised you most? Did you know Tolstoy and Einstein were into Buddhism? And are there other historical figures or philosophies you want me to explore? Seriously, I read every comment. Your suggestions actually shape what videos I make next. Also, if you found this valuable, share it with someone who loves history or philosophy. This kind of content only works if you guys help spread it. Thanks for watching. And remember, the search for truth never ends. These men spent their entire lives questioning, investigating, searching for understanding. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that Buddhism has all the answers, but that the willingness to question everything. That might be the most important thing of all. I'll see you in the next one.